right now. Okay, awesome. Cool. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about React Basics, what it is, how it works, what the different concepts are, and then I'll kind of be transitioning into showing a personal project that I made in React and showing kind of how all of the concepts that I talk about come together. So the goals of this mini course, it's very short, of course, but kind of understanding what React is, how it works, how to build your own React project and what some code looks like. And then I'll kind of show you how a larger project with different technologies works. And you can kind of see how it all can kind of come together. So, admitting one more person. All right, awesome. So I'm not going to assume that you know HTML, CSS, or JavaScript because I'm mainly focused on kind of teaching the concepts behind React, like its underlying structures and how it works. But if you do want to get more into React and learn how it works, I very highly recommend that you learn these three technologies first because they're the building blocks of websites and they have important roles in React as well. So basically, your traditional website mainly consists of three different technologies or languages: HTML for kind of the structure of the website, CSS for styling, and JavaScript for kind of making it programmable and interactive. So on the left right here is HTML, and on the right is JavaScript. And so these were kind of the traditional building blocks of how you made a website before kind of technologies and frameworks like Angular, Vue, and React kind of shifted how websites are built. So now with that, one second, I'm just going to admit some people. Okay. And so with that, now kind of thinking about how else we can structure a website. So with before those technologies, it was about you kind of structured it like HTML and then you styled it and then you had the functions in JavaScript for programmability and interactivity. But what if there was a different way to make a website, a faster, more efficient way to build something like that? And I want to kind of look at an example of the Facebook web page. And so as you can kind of see, there's a lot of different moving parts here. We have recommendations and reviews, we have a feed, we have a comment box, we have a sidebar with lots of different links in it. And as you can probably see, there's a lot of repeated parts of this, right? Like the links here are repeated, and you can see the recommendations here are also kind of repeated as well. And so it would be a real pain to write this in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because you would have to do a lot of repetition and constantly rewrite code. And so that would really make for a painful coding experience. And so with this in mind, technologies like React are really designed to make the writing process for writing code for websites a lot more painless, a lot easier to kind of write code efficiently and have it be better like this. So as you can see, there's a lot of repeated parts of this, like the links and the recommendations. And so this is kind of where React comes in and can become really useful. So great, React comes in, right? So React is, if you didn't know already, it's a library that allows you to build user interfaces with JavaScript. So JavaScript, we talked about it earlier, right? It's how you make websites interactive and programmable and things like that. So React is basically flipping that over its head by saying, why don't we build the entire user interface just using JavaScript? And so that's kind of where the power of React comes from. And so there are three main reasons why a lot of people choose to use React. And one is that it's component based. So if like we saw over here, there are different moving parts to this website. You can kind of call these components, right? There's the logo, there are the different sidebar links, there's the recommendations and reviews. These are all different kind of components, and some of them are repeated and some of them aren't. Some of them house other smaller components. And so this kind of framework, this kind of thinking about it as different components layered on top of each other, parent components and child components, that's kind of the basis of how React works. And so when it's component based, that means that you can reuse different elements, user interface elements over and over again, which makes it really powerful. Second of all, React is declarative, and that means that you write it and it appears. And so React is really easy to kind of get started and start writing and have your code appear on the screen. And you just type out what you want to show and it'll show. So That's also why people like it. And the third thing is that React is stateful. And state is kind of a difficult, murky concept to understand at first, but essentially, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, state is really about the different properties of each component, right? If you have a sidebar component, what are the different properties of it, like variables, and how those variables kind of change. And so with state, the concept is that every time that the state of a certain variable or something changes, then the whole entire thing is re-rendered. So, or that part is re-rendered. So what that allows you to do is allows you to make dynamic web pages that change, and that kind of, you can use multiple variables across different files. And this is a little bit confusing, but it can become really useful once you start getting further into React. But that's another reason why people like using it. Great. So let's talk about the component system first, and why components, in my opinion, are super cool. So if we look back at the Facebook page, and it's right here as well, you can kind of see that there are different components as well. There's the full app, right? But there's also the feed as one smaller component as a part of it, and a sidebar. And the sidebar has a logo. It's got different links that are separate components in and of themselves. And the feed has posts, and within each of those posts are stories and comments. And so in a React project, all of these would kind of be separate files, and they would kind of be organized so that we have parent components like the app and the feed and the sidebar, and child components like the logo, the links, the story, the comments. And so this kind of structure is important because you can easily pass data from parents to children components. So if, for example, in the feed, I get some information from a database in that feed, and I want to take that information and give it to the posts, then it's as simple as calling that child component and giving that data to it. And so I'll show you how you call components and how you kind of structure the code, but this is kind of the basis of how it all works. It's all about components, parent components, child components, structured on top of each other. And I know there's a few people coming in just now, but basically what I'm talking about is how React, which is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, how it's structured and how the component system works. So that's the component system, and it's a pretty neat way to kind of structure websites. And as you can see here in our Facebook example, we have one full nav bar, and then we have separate little links on there. So each of those links is repeated. So instead of having to repeat that code over and over again, you just define one singular instance of that component, and then you can reuse it over and over again. So it's reusable, it's efficient, and it really allows for good code writing. So you can see here, there's a lot of repeated components, and this is kind of how it all comes together. All right, and so now we're going to get into some important terminology. I mentioned some of this earlier, state, I mentioned that earlier, but the first thing that's important is props. And so props is like the React term for passing variables and data from parent components to child components. So like I talked about earlier, when you call the database, if you, sorry, I just got to charge my laptop. If you wanted to pass data from like the feed to like the comment section or something like that, that would be really easy because you could just use props as the variables that are passed from parent to child components. And I'll show how that works in code itself. But for now, that's kind of the concept of how data is passed from parent to child. And then the next thing is state. So state, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of the property values of each component, like what variables are present in each component. And when these values are changed and updated, the component is re-rendered on the screen and the UI is updated. So this allows for a really dynamic way to look at websites and kind of understand how they work. So I'll show how that works in code as well. But for now, these are kind of two really important concepts that you need to know in order to understand React. So great. So one second. Okay. Awesome. So and please let me know in the chat if you have any questions, and I'll have some time for questions, hopefully, after I finished doing all of this. So we're almost to the code, not yet, but we're almost there. And the last thing that we need to know is JSX. So JSX is, the term is a syntax extension to JavaScript. that essentially merges HTML and JavaScript to create React elements. So as I mentioned earlier, HTML is kind of like how the different elements are structured. You can have input elements, you can have button elements, you can have section elements like you see here. And JavaScript is kind of how you program it and make it all happen like that. So JSX is powerful because it kind of merges the two and kind of makes it be like, it allows you to use HTML code in JavaScript itself. So super awesome tool in my opinion. And it's a little bit nerve-wracking or unnerving to get started into because it seems completely new, but once you start getting into it and understanding how it works, it can become quite powerful. And so now, one more thing before we actually get into the code, and you can see code here as well. But if you are familiar with React, you might know that there are two ways that you can define the components. You can either define them as a class, as an ES6 class in JavaScript, or you can define them as a function. And so in this tutorial, you'll notice in a lot of online tutorials that they use classes because they've been around for a long time. But in this tutorial, I'm going to be using functional components because they're the newest and, in my opinion, the most efficient way to write components. And so if you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. We'll get to it soon. But for now, just know that we're going to be using functional components. So now with that out of the way, let's actually get to what the React code actually looks like. So the powerful thing about React is that each component is like a function. And when you call that function, it renders all of the HTML that it's inside each component. So let's take a look. Let's take some example with the nav bar. Let's take so I saw a question in the chat. I'll answer that in just a second. So let's take a look at a nav bar. So a nav bar is the little thing on top of a website that kind of lets you navigate between the different parts of the website. So, and it's essentially a list. And so this is a really rudimentary nav bar, but what you have here is you can have your JavaScript code here and your JSX code below it. So essentially what it's doing is it's a function that returns HTML elements. So right now we have an unordered list with different list elements inside it. And all that function is doing is when you call that function, it'll return that and it'll be rendered on the screen. So it's super easy to use. And if you wanted to call multiple nav bars, you could just do nav bar, nav bar, nav bar, because they're each going to return the same HTML that we see here. So this is the structure of a component. We start with the function. We can put JavaScript code here. And then the JSX code, the HTML JavaScript hybrid, you can return it like this, and then we export it. So this is one file inside the inside our React project. So one last thing before I move on from that is that within the nav bar, you can also, within the JSX, you can also call JavaScript elements. So for here, I define a variable called company name, and I say, hey, that variable is React tutorials. And then the powerful thing is I can use that inside inside the HTML JavaScript combination that I return here. So as you can see here, I have a list element, and I take that company name from here and I bring it into this unordered list. So that way you can kind of integrate JavaScript and HTML in this really nice way and to make really clean code. And so from here, we have a nav bar, right? We want a surrounding app around it. So we define another component and we call it the app component. And we import that file, that navbar file, into this app component. So we say import navbar from navbar, the navbar file. And then all we have to do is call that. So we have a navbar right here. All we have to do is just say navbar. So you might be familiar in other languages with how you call functions, right? It's a really similar concept in React too, but instead of calling a function like you normally would in JavaScript, you write it as if it's an HTML element. So you can see here, I have the navbar that I've defined, and then I'm calling it in the larger app component as well. So app is the parent component, navbar is the child component, and then app takes the navbar file that's written and it renders it on the screen right here. So that's how the app works. And then the last thing that we need to do here is actually render it all on the screen. And so with this, we can basically use, and you don't have to, obviously this is a crash course too. You might not understand all of the code and how it works now, but this is just kind of like a brief primer into how it all works. Basically, you use something called React DOM.render, and then you put the app component, which you can see here similarly to how the nav bar was in the app component. The app component is in this rendering part. So you say app right here, and actually, I don't know if there's a way for me to point to it, but you have the app here, and then you say document.getElementById by ID root. So basically, all there is just an empty HTML file with one element that's called root, and you're taking all of this React code and you're putting it right into that root. So you don't have to worry about any HTML. You don't have to deal with any HTML files. All you have to do is make these React JavaScript files, write all of your code, have all of your components written down, and then call them with react.dom.render. So it's a really simple, in my opinion, once you get into it, it's a really intuitive way to kind of understand how these websites are structured. And one last thing before we continue further, you can, in normal functions in JavaScript, you can only return one thing, right? You can return a number, you can return a string. And so it's the same thing with React as well. So as you can see here in the function, you can only return one element, and the element can have other things inside of it, but you can only return that one element. So with the nav bar, I'm only returning an unordered list. There's multiple things inside it, but it's just an unordered list. And with the app function, I am returning just a div container with a nav bar inside it. So basically, that's another important thing. You can only return one HTML element in, or HTML or JSX element in these functional components. So once again, please let me know in the chat if you have any questions. And one person talked about how it's similar to React Native. And so React Native is, I'm not too familiar with React Native, but React Native is kind of using these similar concepts to make your own apps, right? iOS apps and Android apps. But I think from what I know, it's a really similar concept, but React is more applicable to websites, web apps, progressive web apps, all of those things, whereas React Native is specifically tailored towards apps as in like Android apps and iOS apps. So
yeah.
It's
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Arnav. I just want to, I guess, like add my 2 cents to it as well. I mean, I think if you were to get interested in React through this video and kind of like make your own first React project, you can also go off and create React native apps that will just they'll work on Android and iOS itself. So that's why, you know, this presentation is super awesome, because it's teaching you fundamentals for not only the future of web, but also perhaps the future of mobile apps.
Right, exactly. You can apply these same concepts to React Native as well. And so not only you can build not only just websites, but you can also be building apps as well. So one more question before I continue on with the tutorial. One person asked that pretty new to website building. Should I use React or should I just use HTML, CSS, or JavaScript? So this really boils down to what kind of needs you have and how you want to do it. If you think that React is best suited towards the website that you're building, then use React for sure, because React can be super useful. But if you are building like a static website that doesn't necessarily have too many moving parts, is not too complicated, maybe has a few pages, then HTML, CSS, or JavaScript would be better. But one thing I'll say here is that if you do plan on using React, I highly recommend that you learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript first, especially JavaScript, because all those three will definitely be present in React as well. So it really is depending on your needs and what you feel would be best for your website. I've built websites in HTML, CSS, and I've been fine with it because they're simple for my purposes. And then for other projects I've built, like the one I'm going to show later, I've seen like there's a lot of repeated parts of it and a lot of moving parts. And so I felt that React is best suited towards that particular project. So it really all boils down to what kind of project you want to build and how comfortable you are and how much time you have to build it. So hopefully that answers your question. Just let me know in the chat if you have any others. Awesome. Okay, awesome. So now I want to talk about props, and this is a pretty complicated example that I've shown here because this is from the project that I built, but I think it kind of illustrates it decently well about how props work. So basically we have a parent component, right? Like that app, right? It was like a parent component, right? And that parent component gets words from a database. So I have a database and it gets words from that. And then it passes down those words into a child component. So in this case, the child component is called word list item. And so as you can see here, it takes all of those props being passed, where it says here props being passed, it takes all of those and it puts it inside word list items. So then I actually define the function for that actual component. And so as you can see here is word list item, and I've defined all of the props that I got from that database. I've defined them all right here. And so this is a slightly different way to write functions. Don't worry about it right now because it's something that you learn in JavaScript called arrow functions. But basically what I've done is I've taken that stuff from databases that I got from the parent component. I've brought it to the child component. And then in that third photo, I'm basically taking that data and I'm using it in my child component itself. So that's kind of, it's a pretty intuitive concept once you understand it, basically taking things from parent components and moving them towards child components. So where like the power is that these are two separate files, right? And there's a parent component file and a child component file. And I can basically take variables and move them from one file to the other in a pretty intuitive way. So that's kind of where some of the power of React comes in. I notice I have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to go through these a bit fast. I'm very sorry about that, but I'm going to try and get to my project as well and show you how it all comes together. So using state. So state is obviously a bit of a tricky concept, or at least it was for me. But basically, state can be kind of used through different hooks in React, and hooks are basically kind of like these functions that kind of allow you to make stateful variables and update them. So this is a really simple app. It's this code that I'm showing right here. It's a counting app. And so basically every time the button is clicked, or I'll start again. First, I define a stateful variable, and you can kind of see it says count set count equals use state 0. And so basically means, hey, I've got a variable count, it's set to 0. And then if I want to change that variable and re-render the screen, I can just use set count. And then I have a button right here. And I basically say, every time I click that button, increase the count by 1. So I click that button, the count I call the set count function, and I increase it by 1. And then it updates, it re-renders the UI, updates the screen. And you says here, you clicked this amount of times. So you click count times, right? So this is a super simple example. You could easily do this in vanilla JavaScript as well. But it kind of shows one way that you can kind of use state in your React project. And I'm sorry, this might not make a lot of sense right now since I'm going pretty fast, but essentially state is, I guess, if you have anything to take away, it's a super important concept in React that can be very useful at times. So I'm sorry for the short explanation, but I have a bit more to do, so I'll get to that. So now I want to show an example that I've worked on and show how a lot of these concepts fit together. And obviously, I'm not the best at React. I'm sure there's probably a million problems with my code, and there's probably a lot of ways which I can make it better. But I think it does a good job in kind of showing how the concepts like state, how props, components, how they all kind of come together, and I can kind of show you how a project is structured like that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show my website and kind of show where things like state and other things can kind of come into play. So here's my website. It's called Word Collector, and it's pretty simple. You just find words that interest you and you write them down. It's like a to-do list application almost. And it's got a lot of neat ways which apply a lot of these concepts. So for example, I was talking earlier about how a parent component gets its stuff from a database and brings it down to a child component. Every time I reload this application, that's exactly what's happening. Here are my child components, and then that column right here, that bigger component, the app, that's the parent component. Every time it reloads, it gets information from the database and it displays them each like this. And so you see here, there are repeated different lists. So for my purposes, I said, hey, I have a lot of things that I need to repeat. I think React is the best tool for me. And so that's why I use React. And this is kind of an example of how props work. And then state can also be super useful when you are doing forms as well. So for example, right here, I have something like I want to make a new word list, right? And so then I just say, hey, here's my word list, new list or whatever like that. And so every time I type something new on that screen, it automatically updates the variable every single time I type it. And so one example, this is kind of a bug, but whatever, it illustrates my concept accurately. When I type something here, as you can see here, one 1, 2, 3. If I type something like that, you can see here it's also updating right here and here, right? So that they're sharing the same variable. This is a child component, that little pop-up, and the parent component is what's surrounding it. So that's an example of how state works. And now I want to kind of show how all of the components fit together. So as you can see here, there's a lot of complex stuff. I'm not going to get to all of it, unfortunately, but here's how the component structure works. So I have my full app, right? Then I designate 3 columns, column on the left, column on the middle, column on the right. And then within these, I have different pop-ups called modals, and they pop up right here. I have a list modal, an advanced modal, a delete modal, and these are all child components, and a word list item. That's these things right here. They're child components. And so you can kind of all see how this is structured, right? Parent components, child components, even more child components. And don't worry about the stuff on the right. I'll get to it if I have time, but probably not. So whatever. And so here's the actual code. And so you'll probably be able to see that I'm using a lot of technologies like Firebase, which is Google's version of a cloud database. I'm using Bootstrap for UI interfaces, a lot of different stuff, but it's the same concept, right? I define a function like this. I export it. Then in my index.js right here, it's the exact same thing. I render it and I call the app right here. And then I do document.getElement by ID root. And then if we go here to index.html, div id.root, all of my code goes right here. So that's another great way that you can kind of see how that all kind of comes together. And so you can also see here, I got child components as well. I have my left column, my middle column, my right column. Then on my column, my left column, I have an even further child component. I've defined this component called list modal, and I import it here as well. And so these are all separate files, but you can kind of see how I'm calling them as if they were functions. And so I have list modal right here. And then if I go over here, then you can see how I've written some code here as well. Oh yes. So what application am I using right now? This I don't know if you're referring to the actual code writing thing. So I'm using an application called it's not VS Code, it's called VS Codium. It's slightly similar, but it's basically it's a little bit different from VS Code, but it's pretty much the same thing as VS Code, which is a tool that you can use to write your own code like this. So yep, I'll send access to that recording as well. And I also will share the slides with you in case you want to see the code I've written and the website itself. Although I don't have a premium access to Firebase, so don't use the website that much unless you want to. But here's kind of how it all comes together. So it's obviously a lot more complicated, but you can kind of see how they're structured and kind of how the general concept behind React works. And so I know it's already 11:30. I just want to do one more thing. How to make your own React app, because that's something that I didn't actually share right now. And it's really simple, like kind of suspiciously simple, really. Basically, you download this thing called Node or Node Package Manager. So all you have to do is just download that and then go to your terminal or go to your command prompt. And all you have to do is type in this one command, npx create React app. Type that, you'll get bootstrapped and you'll get started into it, and then you'll be good to go and start writing code. So I know that was probably pretty confusing and there was a lot of different moving parts and all kinds of things like there, but please check out this video again if you want to understand more. There's a lot of good tutorials as well online if you need to. And please let me know if you have any questions. But thanks for listening.
Awesome. Well, Arnav, thank you so much for that presentation.